Afternoon, everybody. I'm Amy Dacey, the Executive Director of the Sign Institute of Policy and Politics here at American University. We're so excited for you to join us this afternoon in our Sign of the Times Summer Series as we explore issues of the day with prominent leaders from various communities. And today we're so excited to have our discussion about Pride as protests, making Pride during two pandemics. And as we celebrate Pride this June, we're asking, how has COVID-19, the financial crisis, and the rash of racial violence we've seen in recent weeks affected the LGBTQ community? At Sign, we bring together various sectors to talk about public policy solutions in a nonpartisan and in addition, we are co-sponsoring this with our AU Pride. AU Pride is American University's premier LGBT student group, and we're excited to have them with us. They helped us with some of the topics that we're going to cover today, and I know many of the members are on with us today as well. I'm so excited and proud to have our guest speaker today, Alphonso David, who is currently the president of the Human Rights Campaign and doing incredible work with that organization. I will say that I've always been overwhelmed with Alphonso's long commitment to social justice. He's an accomplished and nationally recognized LGBTQ civil rights lawyer and advocate. He's, first a civil rights lawyer and then the first person of color to serve as president of HRC. But he's also had a long history at the forefront of the movement for more than a decade and worked with both the state and national level. He was counsel to New York Governors Andrew Cuomo and in his administration in several different positions. And we're so excited to have you here today with us, Alphonso, to share your thoughts about what's happening in the world. And certainly it's been interesting times since we first even discussed having you come and talk to our students in our community here at AU. So much has changed. So I think it would be best to really start with your general thoughts about what's happening, what is happening in the environment today, and so many things. And in a wonderful way, we're having this conversation during Pride Month, which so much of the celebrations and acknowledgements have had to be virtual in these times. So thank you for joining us. And we're so excited to have your thoughts and your ideas today about what's happening.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And thank you to the Sign Institute at American University. And Amy, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. This afternoon, we're going to talk about Pride. And when we talk about Pride, we also must talk about protest, because Pride began with protest. We're celebrating Pride Month this year, and we're celebrating at a unique moment in our history. We have seen our nation's highest court recognize LGBTQ people are protected from discrimination under federal civil rights laws. And we've seen the court block Donald Trump's attack on Dreamers. Mm-hmm. We've seen a rash of horrific violence against Black and transgender communities. And we have seen, amidst a pandemic, righteous protesters take to the streets to make sure that their voices are being heard loud and clear. To uphold the legacy of Pride and to achieve full equality, we need to commit to joining protesters and all those who are fighting alongside them to defeat discrimination, to defeat racism, to defeat white supremacy, and to defeat the broken systems that allow injustice to flourish. We cannot forget that Stonewall and the pockets of resistance and riots that proceeded at Cooper's Donuts and the Black Cat and Compton's Cafeteria were a response to police brutality. These acts of resistance were led in many places by transgender women of color. These early leaders lived every day with the threat of police brutality and oppression, and they refused to give up. They refused to accept violence. They refused to accept oppression as the only possible means for them to live through. We must recognize that their resistance laid the groundwork for the modern LGBTQ movement. But we must also recognize that today, that the movement is moving forward largely without effectively answering the cries of those who first threw those bricks. Those who were and still are largely targeted by police, LGBTQ Black and brown people. It has fallen to Black and brown leaders, and specifically trans leaders and movement partners, to center the most marginalized among us. Now we have to start again. We have to center ourselves in a radical and fundamental understanding that we will not be free until all of us is free, or all of us are free. Black Lives Matter leaders have known this all along, and in their leadership, they've accomplished something really vital. They have forced non-Black people in this country to use their voices to fight against injustice that Black people have lived with for a very long time and unfortunately continue to do so. The only way that we can make lasting change is if we see beyond ourselves. It has been a vital part of the success of the LGBTQ civil rights movement. Our allies seeing themselves in a same-sex couple fighting for equal marriage rights, in a mother of a transgender kid fighting for the safety of her child, in a bisexual teacher fired for simply coming out. By seeing the humanity in our neighbors, we reaffirm our own. This radical understanding, this moral evolution and revolution requires us to embrace anti-racism and take action to end white supremacy, not as necessary correlations or corollaries to our struggle, but as integral to the fight for full equality for all of us. That is what our movement in this moment demands of all of us. And that is ultimately what Pride is all about. It is about taking pride in our actions. It's about taking pride in our right to vote, a constitutional right that we all have. It's about taking pride in our power to make change. And it's about taking pride in the victories that are yet to come. We have achieved so much, but we have so much work to do. And I'm so happy to join you, Amy, in having this conversation about pride, having this conversation about protest, and in having this conversation about our respective roles in advancing the struggle, the quest for full equality.
I can't think of a better, overview or insight into the world that we're looking at. I think you mentioned the Supreme Court ruling. I mean, on June 15th, there was this landmark Supreme Court ruling. And I guess, it was, were you shocked? And how important are the courts in this? You say it starts with protests, but how important are the courts in general? And then how important was this decision?
Well, let me answer your second question first, because I think it provides a little bit more, for me, context. Protest is so important, but so is exercising our constitutional right to vote in order to effectuate change. What I'm saying is pride plus vote equals change. Why is voting so important? Because when you vote for elected officials to represent your interests and their pro-equality elected officials, those pro-equality elected officials are not going to appoint justices to courts who will try to erode your rights and your protections. Those elected officials will actually interpret the law in a way that provides equality for all of us. So peaceful protesting is incredibly important, but we have to exercise our rights to vote. Now, having said that, the Supreme Court decision is a landmark decision for many reasons. The court basically affirmed federal court decisions that have said for more than 20 years that LGBTQ people are protected under federal civil rights laws. Many have challenged those laws, arguing that LGBTQ people are not protected. The court rejected those arguments and said, we had this principle called the rule of law, this principle called stare decisis. We're respecting decisions that have interpreted the civil rights law, Title VII, to be inclusive of protections along the lines of gender identity and sexual orientation. And it's a significant decision because LGBTQ people in many parts of this country, and in fact, around the globe, are fearful when they go to work. You get married over a weekend and you're fearful of taking your wedding picture and putting it on your desk. You're afraid of coming out of work. You're afraid of disclosing who your friends are because you might be outed. And so this decision effectively provides the dignity to LGBTQ people in the workplace that we all deserve. We still have a lot of work to do, but the judiciary, as to your earlier point, has always served as a significant pillar of government that provides protections to marginalized communities. And we are heartened to see this Supreme Court decision. Another very important decision was the Dreamers decision that came out last Thursday that basically said
it was quite a week last week.
It was quite a week.
It was quite a week.
You know? So, but that is a testament to, we have to believe in the rule of law. We have to believe in stare decisis. We have to believe in the judiciary, because it has been a place that we go to make sure we can vindicate our rights.
I think it's important to note too that, as you mentioned with the vote, like we have to be ever vigilant as well, because securing these rights or having legislation passed or protesting is one thing, but this is something that we have to protect once we have it. And sometimes that might even be the harder fight, is to make sure that it's not taken away once we have some of these, right? I mean, it's still a possibility, so.
It's such an important right that we have, and in many cases, it is being taken away. Look at what happened in Georgia a few weeks ago. Look at what happened in Wisconsin. And if, for people who don't know, please look it up, but I'll give you a brief preview. In Wisconsin, polling stations were closed in largely minority districts. So if you are a racial minority and you're going to cast your vote and your polling station is closed and you have to travel to actually cast your vote, are you going? And you may not have the resources to do that. So our right to vote is being oppressed in so many places. In Georgia, the absentee ballots were not mailed in time. They didn't have sufficient poll workers. They had long lines. The machines didn't work. Those are voter suppression tactics that have been used against Black and brown communities in this country for decades. And we have to be incredibly vigilant to make sure that our right to vote is protected, because there are many forces that are trying to muzzle us from having our votes count.
It's interesting, Alphonso, because some of the things that you mentioned, the challenges for voting or, you know, access, some of those things are either health-wise or financial, you know, sometimes barriers too. So my question is, with COVID-19, with coronavirus, has the pandemic disproportionately impacted the LGBT community in those areas, then creating other challenges as well, like you said, with, you know, possible voting? But how has the LGBT community and other marginalized populations been disproportionately affected by this, you know, situation we're in with this global pandemic?
So the coronavirus pandemic has really disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities, and also the LGBTQ community. With respect to the LGBTQ community, many people don't know this. 1 out of 5 LGBTQ people live in poverty. 1 out of 5 LGBTQ people have not gone to see a doctor because they cannot afford to see one, meaning they don't have access to health care. More than 40%, 40% of LGBTQ people work in industries that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, meaning they've lost their jobs, they've been furloughed, or they have reduced hours. 40% of LGBTQ people are in that sort of paradigm. And as we think about how COVID-19 is affecting the community, if you have lost your job, if you're unable to pay your mortgage, unable to pay your rent, unable to actually provide meaningful resources to your family, it affects, in some cases, whether or not you have the ability to go and exercise your right to vote. And so we also want to make sure that we are making it easier for people to vote, which is why the Human Rights Campaign has launched a campaign, Vote Equal, Vote Safe, to make sure that people can vote and they have the resources available to them to vote. One of the tools that we have is vote by mail. It shouldn't be the only option available to people, but if you are unable to leave because you have a weakened immune system, if you're unable to leave because you're an elderly person, you should be able to vote by mail. In many states, that is not an option. Absentee balloting is an option, but there are so many strings attached to absentee balloting. 1, you may never receive the ballot. 2, in some instances, you're required to have a witness assign the absentee ballot. And third, you have to have a legitimate reason for submitting the absentee balloting in some states. We have to remove those restrictions so people have the ability to vote.
Well, it's exciting that you're doing this new initiative. I imagine so much of it in the LGBT community and other communities is about education. It's literally about having them understand and have a plan to vote. I think it recently was talking about, it's not enough to say you're going to vote. Like, you have to have a plan, because some of those barriers and challenges exist, and you have to know what is happening in your own community.
Yeah, and for some people, just showing up, we are trying to orient people so they understand you might face challenges, you might face long lines, it may be raining, it may be snowing, but you have to stand in line. You have to make sure your voice is counted. We have to push back at systems that are trying to oppress marginalized voices. And that's what we have to do, particularly for this election. This is an opportunity for us to really affect change on a grand scale. And in order for us to do that, we need to make sure that everyone has an ability to have their voice heard.
It's interesting you mentioned, I mean, obviously coming out of protest, I think we've seen with the death of George Floyd and communities coming together. One of our AU Pride members asked, how do allies help with the movement, and how do they support efforts for equality? Because obviously it's stronger if more voices are heard. So how are allies coming together? How can they impact this conversation right now?
I think first, it's important for allies to think about how we might be able to change our mindsets. So being an ally is really great, but I would rather you be an advocate. Be an advocate for change, so that you are taking on this fight as your own. Volunteering, at the Human Rights Campaign, we have volunteer opportunities. There is Community Hub, which is a site that you can go to. If you go to the Human Rights Campaign's website, www.hrc.org, you can go into a hub called Community Hub that identifies all of the volunteering opportunities in your home district.
Right.
You can participate every Tuesday. We call into the swing states: Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Texas. Those are the states that we believe hold the keys, based on last year's projections, hold the keys to this year's election. We call them the swing states.
Yeah.
Florida is also included in some cases, and other include North Carolina. But we are working in those swing states to reach out to equality voters. Equality voters are those who are inclined to prioritize LGBTQ issues, equality issues at the ballot box. But we need to engage with them. We need to make sure they have the information that they need in order to adequately understand and appreciate how important this election is. We are all bombarded with a lot of information that people don't have time to process. So our objective is making sure that we provide them with the information, the resources, so that they can exercise their rights to vote. But I would say, for those who are thinking, how can I get involved? Please envision yourself as being an advocate and not necessarily an ally. And also volunteer. You can donate to organizations like the Human Rights Campaign. We're a not-for-profit organization. We're doing this work. And it helps us actually do both the electoral work as well as the program work.
I love the word advocate, because it's so proactive. It's so, and I do think that's what we need, right? Is to have people being active. And I think the great thing about the volunteer network you're talking about is, in an interesting way, somebody in the LGBT community might live in a community that's more open and accepting, and they feel, but we can't assume that that's like that throughout the country. So this is a way to help in other communities to really share that, expand, the knowledge, and help people in maybe not your own community to have access to that information they need, so that they're making the right decisions, or they can get involved.
And Amy, just to put a finer point on that, in 29 states in this country, there are no comprehensive non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. So if someone says, well, what does that really mean?
Yeah.
So in 29 states in this country, there are no state law protections to prohibit discrimination in housing, in public accommodations, in credit, in education, which means that if you're LGBTQ, you could face discrimination in those states, and you would have no recourse under state law. So then your response is, well, of course, federal law would protect us. The answer there is in some cases, no.
No.
There's no federal law that provides protections for LGBTQ people in terms of non-discrimination as it relates to public accommodations. Going to a dentist's office, going to a movie theater, transportation hubs is another. So if I get into a Lyft or to an Uber, going from work home or going from home to a social event, I may live in a state that has no state law protections and there are no federal protections, which means that if I face discrimination through a transportation hub, I would have no recourse. So it's important for us to reach out as advocates to advance this information to those who may not know so that we can affect change on a broad scale.
Well, and it just proves another point that it's so important to understand who your public officials are, who is representing you locally, because these decisions sometimes I think we assume are made at the national level. But again, elections matter, like who's representing you, but also to be aware of what, you know, legislation rules are on the books in your own state, which might be different from, you know, somebody else that, you know, a family member that is as well in a different state says, well, we can do. The fact that it's not universal, you know, and that they can have an impact, I think is really important.
You have same-sex couples all over the country, just the last point, who are married and are thinking about, if we move to another state, are we going to be compromised?
I can't even imagine that that would have to be, when they should be deciding like what, you know, is the best school system, what could we do, you know, where are we near family, but to have that be still a deciding factor when you're making those decisions.
It's right.
There's still, to your point, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yes.
But I guess one question I have is, because there is, you know, for HRC, you do so much as an organization, you know, what are the tools in your toolbox? You know, what is most effective? The movement, we talked about protests, but legislation, the courts, the business community, and having to partner with them, public opinion, making sure the right elected officials are working with you. It seems like all of those are important. That's a lot, you know, of different layers to get to, you know, the place we want to be.
Yeah, I would say because we are the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization in the world, we do so much. For people who may not be familiar with the organization, I would say it's probably simple to put it into 3 different buckets. The first bucket is electoral public policy, where we support public officials, we endorse candidates, we engage in elections all over the country, up and down the ballot, from the presidential races to local races. The second bucket, I would say, are programs. We provide resources and support to LGBTQ people and non-LGBTQ people all across the country. So we have 11 different programs that range from the HIV/AIDS program to the Historically Black Colleges and Universities program to Welcoming Schools, which is making sure that we have inclusive LGBTQ curricula for schools. And then finally, the last bucket I would say is education and outreach, where we do an incredible amount of work, create a lot of resources and research to make sure that influences and informs public policy. We want to make sure that elected officials have the facts when they're evaluating public policy. I often say that public policy is driven by fear, not by facts. And we have to shift that paradigm. Public policy has to be driven by facts, not fear. But in terms of the tools that we have, through the electoral space, we have more than 57 million equality voters who are going to engage in this election, and they hold the keys to this election. So we're working with them to make sure that they are engaged not only at the presidential race, but congressional races and local races as well.
Yeah.
In terms of our programs, we're working with businesses, we're working with other not-for-profit organizations to leverage our existing resources so that we can reach as many people as possible. We have a program called the Corporate Equality Index. And that Corporate Equality Index effectively evaluates whether or not companies have inclusive policies. We have more than 1,000 businesses that are participating. Why is that important? Well, important because if I'm LGBTQ and I'm looking for a job, I can look to see whether or not that company is listed on the Corporate Equality Index, and I can see whether or not that company has very good LGBTQ policies. And that can influence my choice as to company A versus company B. So that's another tool in our toolbox that we use to not only inform the public about services and resources that are available to them, but also to hold businesses accountable. to make sure that they are providing inclusive and safe work spaces for their employees. And there are so many different tools, but I mean, we have tools in the electoral space, tools in the programmatic space, as well as in the education outreach space.
Well, I think it's important for obviously all those to come together, but it's important that each sector, you know, the business community has to step up. Certainly our elected officials have to step up when we're having these conversations. You know, it's interesting. One of the students asked a question, and I'm very curious to hear what your answer to this would be. They asked, in the face of the commercialization of Pride, what can queer young people do to find their way back to the roots of the community while celebrating their identities? They always ask the best questions.
Fantastic question. What I would say is we all need to find a way to personally own Pride and take a look back at our history. And when we think about personal advocacy, yes, Pride has been commercialized over the past few years, but we cannot forget the people who took us here, the people who died as a result of the struggle to get here. So I would say, as we think about the commercialization of Pride, think about your personal advocacy in advancing Pride and how we can use our history to inform every single person who about the importance of that history.
Okay.
Most people may not know they may know about all of the civil rights leaders who came before us, who were responsible and are responsible, I should say, for the modern civil rights movement.
I think it's important because, you know, as each generation comes to these issues, they're faced with a different reality as far as, you know, what Supreme Court decisions are being made, like what elections. So for young people now, it seems to me that this is, you know, an opportunity, like you mentioned, to voting. This is really an opportunity for them to understand the importance of that. And certainly that has to become a part of just what they do and not what if I'm going to do it, you know? So again, it's a way to use your voice. I think it's so important to have Pride in June to talk about the history and certainly, you know, the fights that the community has had, but every month there should be a way to make sure that we're doing that. And certainly some of the months coming up are going to be pretty important to have that conversation.
Indeed.
And another question they asked, which I think is interesting, we are in this place where we're, you know, going through this pandemic. There's health implications, financial implications. We are having this conversation around race in this country that we haven't, I think, that we've seen before. One of the questions was, what should the priorities of primarily white LGBTQ organizations be in promoting racial justice? And so how can some of the, you know, non-Black members of the community help to support this conversation around race and equality?
I think they should, and in many cases are, making race core and central to our struggle for equality. A few weeks ago, I had the privilege of drafting a letter with another colleague of mine from Equality Florida. And the letter has now been signed on by more than 600 LGBTQ organizations. And the core takeaway from that letter was that LGBTQ organizations were saying that racial justice was not going to be a necessary corollary to their missions, but was going to be core and central to their mission in effectuating equality. That's what we need to do, and in so many different ways, from the programmatic work to the administrative work, from thinking about who you hire to who you promote. And white LGBTQ leaders can also appreciate that for much too long, Black and brown voices have been stifled. Black and brown voices have been left out in the cold. We have not been the ones who most people would listen to when we talk about equality and justice, despite the fact that history proves otherwise, despite the fact that history shows that Black and brown members of our community have been the ones who have been leading the charge. And I think that is something that white leaders could and should do. How can I make sure that the focus of our mission is really grounded in racial justice? And that is going to manifest itself in our programmatic work. It's also going to manifest itself
is self-administrative work. We have to do both.
It's also interesting to me, like I mentioned in your introduction, you had a long, career in public service, and you were inside an administration, a governor's administration in New York. How do you think your work in the public sector, and thank you, I always like to thank people who take that on to work in the public sector. How do you think that's helped you to take on this role as an advocate in a nonprofit group to try and influence that side of, because I know a lot of the young people have said they're trying to find ways that they can influence the system, whether they go to work in the public sector or a nonprofit. And I think you've got such an incredible perspective of having both. So I'm wondering how that helped you for some of the things that you're taking on now for the organization.
So I would say this, I have experience in the public sector, the private sector, and the not-for-profit sector.
Okay.
And all three bring value to my thinking on how to achieve success. I'll give you a little story. I worked at Legal, which is litigated the marriage case in New York for 3 years. We won at the trial court and ultimately lost at the high court in New York. And I had a choice to make at that point. Whether I thought it would be more effective for me to continue doing that work from that perspective or do it from a different perspective. And I went in government because I thought there was a moment in time where I could advance LGBTQ equality and really advance the rights of other marginalized communities, because we had a leader in Andrew Cuomo who was really supportive of LGBTQ rights. And there was an opportunity for me to really advance the rights of LGBTQ people from the inside as opposed to the outside. Now, there are pros and cons because there are certain limitations that you have in government. You have to make sure that you are applying the rules in a way that you would to anyone. You have to make sure that you are being an objective evaluator of whatever the proposals or initiatives are that come to your desk. You're not focused only on one community, you are focused on the entire population. So, but you can, if you are working with the right people, advance the cause for justice if they're like-minded people that support those principles. And as a result, I was able to draft the marriage equality law in New York. So it was a bookend where I got to work on the litigation and also help to draft the legislation in New York. And I couldn't have done that from the outside. Right? I wouldn't have had the access, I wouldn't have had the ability to work on that piece of legislation from the outside. So as young people think about where can I have the most impact, I really think is a difficult question to answer because it all depends on the context. Where do you live? What are you considering? Who would you be working with and for? Because that is going to inform to a large degree which choice is a better choice in terms of effectuating impact. And also keep in mind that each position that you take on may have a lifetime ban. I'm trying to get the phrase right, but a timeline is what I'm thinking.
Timeline.
There may be a timeline that's attached to a certain position, and understand that going in. Understand it may not be forever. Understand it may be for 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 years. But understand that in every position you go in, that there may be limitations with respect to time and what you can achieve.
It's interesting. I'm sure you've had the same experience, especially when talking to young people. I try to tell them it's not really a ladder and it's not a straight line. I'm sure your career has been more of a jungle gym than an actual ladder, when you think through how you got to these places. But you talk about some of the work that you did when you were in the administration. I think it would be really interesting to know for people that are in the community, people that aren't in the community, like, what do you see? The Supreme Court decision was a huge decision. It was a huge milestone. But what issues would we be surprised about are still a challenge for the community that you're focused on at your organization and still advocating for to try and change for this community that we might be surprised by?
There's so many. One is HIV. 1 out of 2 Black men who identify as gay or bisexual will contract HIV in their lifetime. 1 out of 2. So this idea that HIV is dead is a flawed concept. It is very, very much alive in many parts of our communities, and specifically we're seeing a spike in the South. It's affecting Black men, it's affecting Latinx men, disproportionately so. And that is something that we need to address in a much more impactful and meaningful way. We also have to address the plight of violence that is facing members of the transgender community. Yes. The Human Rights Campaign has been tracking the killings of transgender people since 2013. And since 2013, we have at least 178 transgender people have been killed in this country. Most of them are people of color, most of them are Black women. Last year, at least 27 people were killed. This year, at least 16 have been killed. So there is a crisis that is facing the transgender community. We've launched a transgender justice initiative. We have a national director who's managing that program that focuses on employment, capacity building, anti-violence work, as well as education and outreach. But there's a lot more work that we have to do in that space. We also have to make sure that the conservative right is not able to use flawed religious arguments in order to roll back LGBTQ rights. And we've seen that happen in some instances where the argument is, well, we're going to deny a same-sex couple the right to be an adoptive parent or parents or serve as foster parents because it offends the core tenets of our faith. My answer is then don't provide services to the public, because you can't say I'm providing services to the public and yet I want the right to discriminate against which members of the public I provide services to. So that is going to be an issue that we have to address moving forward as well. And then finally, I would say at its core, and what sort of drives so much of this, is our democracy. Yeah. We are fighting for our democracy. And make no mistake, this election is one of the most consequential, if not the most consequential election of our lifetimes. And we have seen a strategic chipping away at our democracy and the institutions that support our democracy, from the Department of Justice to the media. And we have to seize back our democracy, otherwise we will lose it. I unfortunately have experience in that. I lived in a country where it was a democratically led government that shifted over to a dictatorship in the course of a few hours, where there was a military coup. So our democracy is fragile if we don't invest in it. And we have to make sure we invest in it and make sure those pillars are very strong in order for this construct to support us living collaboratively, supportively, and under the principles of equality and justice.
I so appreciate your willingness to share that personal experience, because I think some of the frustration that sometimes people have organized is that people take for granted that these systems are in place and they're strong, and that we have nothing to worry about. And I do think that's the question. Are they putting questions on what is our democracy? We're having really good conversations about the police and law enforcement in this country as well. I think in every aspect of our social institutions, like, how are we having that conversation? And so I appreciate you being willing to share that, because I think sometimes people have a perception, especially because we have such a short lifespan compared to many other countries, about what we're able to do. It's got to be challenging, though, being a leader of a national organization. You must have two fronts, though. You're fighting for national legislation, but individual states you want to make an impact in. Do you partner with community organizations and states to try and make an impact there? Do you find that there's that ability to have organizations within their own state that are trying to also work on these issues that people should know about?
Yes. So we partner with organizations in the electoral space, in the programmatic space, in the education outreach spaces. My objective coming and running this organization is to really drive one of the most fundamental principles I adopted a long time ago, is if you work collaboratively, you can achieve impact quicker and much more in a much more impactful way. If you operate in a silo and you operate with blinders on, you may achieve a success, but that success will not be sustainable and will not have the impact. And I feel very strongly about the importance of thinking about creating those collaborations and those relationships where we may not all agree on what the answer is, but we should certainly have conversations about how to approach or create a path to getting to the right answer. Because I value dissenting voices, constructive dissenting voices. And I think that as we advance the movement for equality, there's so many different perspectives that people bring to the table. And understanding those perspectives help inform your view and help you achieve a much more, I would say, a sustainable impact, as opposed to, you know, getting a win, but that win is taken away from you 2 years later. We have to make sure we are building systems and those systems are sustainable. So you can only do that in collaboration.
And, you know, I just want to remind people that we're taking questions, so please keep them coming in. One question for you, Alphonso, is, you know, about students going, you know, into college and, you know, coming out of their, you know, community that they grew up in, and they're going off to college. How can they make an impact if they're passionate about these issues, are a part of the community, or want to support the community? I'm sure that you have youth programs as well, you know, at HRC, or you mentioned, and we will certainly post as well the ways to volunteer and to you know, help at HRC. But as a young person, what would you advise of somebody who cares about this, how they can get involved and make an impact?
So we do have the Youth Ambassadors Program. We have both a global program and a domestic program. So I would ask folks to get on our website. They can learn more about those programs. We can certainly send specific links so that they can go directly to those programs. I would say evaluate those programs and see whether or not they're helpful. We also have fellowship programs and internship programs. Those, unfortunately, are not being advanced in the same way they were in the past because of COVID-19. But those are certainly programs that we have. Those programs exist, and we will be expanding those programs in the future. So that also is another opportunity. And I would say, follow your passion. And if you're interested in this work, volunteer. If you're interested in this work, contact us and say you would like to engage with us in some way. We are certainly would welcome the help in the engagement, and specifically from people who are committed and passionate about the work, because we have a lot of work to do. So there are many ways to volunteer. There are many ways to get involved. I would encourage people to explore all those options.
Here's another good question that we're going to keep you on your toes here, Alphonso.
Okay.
Is there any specific moment in the course of the movement that has made the most impact or was the most significant milestone?
Ooh.
That's a tough one. I mean,
that is an unfair question. I cannot answer that question without dying of 1,000 cuts.
Well, was there one, let me rephrase a little maybe to help you. Was there one that was a building block that then helped really kind of move things out to get?
There's so many. Evan Wolfson arguing the case in Hawaii to allow same-sex couples to marry, which completely changed the cultural zeitgeist. The state of New York passing a piece of legislation allowing people to marry, which once again changed the cultural zeitgeist. Joe Biden talking about marriage equality on Meet the Press, saying yes.
Big moment. It was a big moment.
It was a huge moment.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's only marriage equality. You know, we can talk about the Matthew Shepard, who was unfortunately murdered, and what that did for the movement in terms of advancing hate crimes legislation. We can talk about transgender rights specifically, and something as recent as Pose, the television show Pose, which has really opened up the eyes of many people who may not have interacted with anyone who's transgender, and they're getting a chance to see a certain perspective is not reflective of the trans experience writ large, but they're seeing a certain perspective that they may not have seen before. Or Sylvia Rivera or Marsha P. Johnson fighting back at Stonewall is a moment that I think defined the moment and the movement that I would have to mention as well. Or, you know, James Baldwin, who is on my wall, writing about equality and justice and about value, and how, you know, this, the US construct, as we call it, the experiment, has really done a disservice to Black and brown people. When he started writing about those themes in the 50s and the 60s, it sort of changed what people thought about. So there's so many different landmarks. It's difficult to point to one that I would say is defining of the movement, because we are really operating on a very strong foundation of leaders and luminaries from the past who created a path for us that we're on now.
It's unbelievable how many people have contributed over the decades to moving us to this point. And as you mentioned, the fight still goes on. You brought up Pose. I'm very curious. There must have been times when the entertainment industry, the music industry had helped and hurt the cause as well. I mean, it's such a large platform. So how can, I think holding the industry accountable to make sure that the community is represented in the right way has to be a big part of making sure that people's perceptions aren't skewed, or they're not getting a true meaning of what this is. So
yeah, an example is the Human Rights Campaign. We have this corporate equality index that I mentioned to you before, which really evaluates whether or not companies have inclusive policies. And recently we had to take a position against Hallmark, because Hallmark, there was an ad of two women kissing at a wedding. Hallmark took down the ad under some pressure. And as a result, our position was, then you're not an inclusive company and we will not rank you as high as we've ranked you before. And as a result of the actions that we took, and other organizations were involved as well, Hallmark changed their position. And they said, they apologized to the community for removing the ad. But to your point, we've also seen really offensive representations of LGBTQ people in media for quite some time. It has certainly changed, but we've seen really offensive and non-representative images of LGBTQ people as, as victims, as the ones who always die, as the ones who are attackers, as the ones who are, attacking young kids. And none of that is reflective of the facts, where we've seen people sort of conflate concepts and ideas. So there's a lot of work that we've done. Will and Grace was certainly a significant landmark. And I think there are many other shows. I don't want to leave any out. Noah's Ark is another that I personally enjoyed as a Black man, seeing those images reflected on the screen and seeing how it is so important that we respect the representation of marginalized communities and accurate representations of them on the screen. Philadelphia, the list goes on. Things have changed, but I still think we have a lot of work to do, and the Human Rights Campaign and others are involved in this to make sure that we hold businesses and largely the media responsible.
I think so many people can also use their voice to call that out when they think it's not appropriate. But you've also got so many incredible spokespeople from the community that are from various, whether it's sports or entertainment or the business community or media. How important is it that they use their voices and to help, bring enlightenment to, and bring also individuals to support the cause? And you must use those voices in a way to kind of help. It's important for everyone to be able to see somebody in their community that looks like them, represents them, that's a part of the LGBT community.
It is so important,
Yeah.
Not only LGBTQ people, but non-LGBTQ people to use their voices to push back against LGBTQ bigotry and anti-LGBTQ sentiment. Jesse Tyler Ferguson, as an example, who was on Modern Family,
Yes.
Has used his voice so brilliantly to make sure that he elevate LGBTQ voices. There are many others. Sally Field has done the same thing. Meryl Streep has done the same thing. So we have celebrities who have sort of risen up and appreciated that their voice will have an impact in the public discourse, and they think that they can serve as effective advocates. We work very closely with them. And then we also work with CEOs of companies who understand also that they have a voice and that they can influence cultures. They can influence the culture within their industry. They can influence the culture within their business. And we want them to use their voices to affect change as well.
And so, for individuals who want resources, who need support, who might be facing challenges as they, talk about their being a part of the LGBT community, whether with their families, or does HRC also provide support for individuals who find it difficult sometimes within their own community to share, their identity?
Yes. So as I mentioned before, we have 11 different programs, and those programs range from birth to death. We have programs that provide services to those who are elderly. We have programs that provide services to those that are in middle school and junior high school and high school and college. And so all of those services are available. One of the issues that causes me some concern now that we're going through COVID-19 are young people who are at home. And maybe they're not out to their family. And maybe this is the first time, and they're concerned about being open and out to their family. Some have contemplated suicide. So we've worked with other organizations like the Trevor Project to make sure that we are providing support, providing resources, connecting people to the resources that they need. And at the Human Rights Campaign, we're doing that, or other organizations are as well.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned how COVID's impacted young people who might be living at home with their parents. I think for a lot of people, we talk about the economic risks as well. That statistic you said, about 40% of the community in these industries that are the most impacted. Do you have any kind of information about, or how do we need to support small business owners who are also LGBTQ or in the community, because I'm sure that they're being impacted as we move into different phases in these different states. I'm sure there's a lot of the individual worker, but also business owners, I think, would be seriously impacted in this way as well.
Yeah, business owners have been seriously impacted. And so we have been providing support to those business owners to make sure, to the extent they have questions, we're able to potentially connect them to the resources that are available. One sort of concern that we had is the stimulus packages that have been issued by Congress. They were great, but in 29 states in this country, there are no non-discrimination protections. So, you know, the statute may be fine, the implementation may not be.
It's literally unequal in implementation because there's not continuity.
Correct. So we have been pushing to make sure that the stimulus packages include non-discrimination protections, because we're fearful that in some states, those protections, because they don't exist, LGBTQ people may have challenges gaining access to basic resources that we believe that everyone should be entitled to.
You know, it's interesting. I even came to you and your team and said it would be great to have this conversation during June, and it's Pride Month. As the leader of one of the largest LGBTQ organizations, what's July 1st like? I mean, you still have to fight these fights. So what do we want people doing July 1st? Because, I mean, there is a challenge. Like every month we should focus on these issues and move them forward. And it's great to have the awareness with June. But how do we keep having this conversation and making sure that we're making people aware of the challenges? We're also telling them what the opportunities are to make change as we kind of move forward.
You will be hearing more from the Human Rights Campaign about our priorities for the next few months. But if there's one thing I would say that people should focus on, July, August, September, October, November, we're there in 5 months. And we need to make sure that our voices are heard. I don't have to get ideologically specific, except to say that we want to make sure that people can exercise their rights to vote, and we need to make sure that the resources are there for them to do it. And so we are working with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We're working with UNUDOS. We're working with Vote Latino. We're working with a variety of organizations to make sure that people can exercise their right to vote, which I believe is going to be key and central to seizing our democracy back and really making sure that it's reflective of what we all believe it should be in the Constitution.
Yeah, it's going to be such a focus. We are in an election year, and in a great way, we've seen some primaries recently. There are some people from the LGBTQ community that are winning primaries, that are running. There are certainly, if you also want to support candidates who are from the community, who, you know, identify, it's a great way to also, we want diversity certainly in our elected officials so that everybody can see themselves, whether it's in the halls of Congress or in their local council. There are opportunities. And I think that there's a lot of energy. Some of these young people should consider running or being a part of, you know, leadership somewhere that helps move that forward. Every chance I get to tell somebody to run for office, I'm like, do it.
Well, I'll give them a little bit of a prodding, just so they understand that the equality voters are there. We had in most cases, LGBTQ voters account for about 4.5% of the population in each state. For the primaries, they accounted for 10% of the voters.
10%.
10%, in some cases 12% of the voters, although they only account for 4.5% of the voters in those states.
Mm.
So LGBTQ voters are punching above their weights. And we need to make sure that others who support equality are picking up the mantle to represent their constituents, to represent their neighbors, to make sure that we have inclusive policies, because that is so important moving forward.
If you don't mind, one of the questions from the young people was more of a personal one from your experience. They wanted to know if your career in social justice, was it because of where you're from and the challenges to democracy in the country that you grew up in? I mean, did this really kind of instill in you to go down this path, or was there a moment when you said, I want to do this work?
I think there were 2 or 3 moments that refined my current path and trajectory. One was living in Liberia, living under democracy, losing it, and living under a dictatorship and living under house arrest for close to 3 years. Having my father be in prison simply because of his political ideology. My uncle was assassinated because of his political ideology. So I was initially being groomed to be a surgeon, to be a doctor. I was supposed to go to Oxford and then come back to Liberia and practice medicine. That changed after the war. And I think that led me on the path of the law, because I understood that our lives are governed by the law. Nothing else really governs us as much as the law. And whether or not as a kid, I was thinking, well, the traffic lights, they go from red, yellow to green, but then at a certain time of night, they start flickering. Who decides that? And my dad said, the law.
That's flat out the law.
Well, somebody decided that that's when at midnight the lights are going to start flickering. And for me, and after the war, it became clear to me that the law can be manipulated. And we've seen it manipulated for a long time. Dred Scott, a Supreme Court case, said that I, as a Black man, was not a full person under the Constitution. Bragdon versus Abbott considered me to be a criminal under law. So we've seen the law manipulated, and I wanted to make sure that I use my gifts, be that what they are, to advance the cause for equality, because I wanted to manipulate the law in a way that it is going to benefit those who is been structured to benefit. It should be manipulated in a way to achieve equality and inclusivity, because many have read it to be exclusive. Many have read the law to say, you're not a part of this, when in fact, the intent was, just on the page, there was no intent to exclude. But nevertheless, they have manipulated the law to exclude people. And I'm trying to use the law in a way that it was intended to be used. And that is why I do what I do. But there are many touch points that help me refine my vision as to what I wanted to do with my life.
Well, we just have time for one more question. I'm going to take the liberty to ask it because I'm curious. So much of what's happening now is, it seems like the weight of the world is on us, between the health crisis, the financial crisis, certainly the challenges with race in this country, and the conversations that we're having. And anybody with your background, with what you've seen, could be despondent or let down. Or what inspires you? What are you hopeful about that this moment might push us toward? What do you think could come out of this that you're hopeful about?
I am hopeful that this moment forces us to see beyond ourselves. And if we're able to do that, we're able to achieve equality. It sounds simple, but for some people, it's much more complicated, because it forces you to take a break and stop and say, how can I, as an individual, see beyond myself? How can I identify priorities that affect my neighbors, although it may not directly affect me? That's immigration for some people. That's LGBTQ rights for others. That's women's rights for others. When we think about marginalized communities, we often have marginalized communities fighting for themselves. How do we get to the point where the masses are also fighting to make sure that we have equality? I am encouraged by the images that I see of the protesters all across the country. Many of the faces are not Black and brown. So those people who are protesting are seeing beyond themselves in the act of protest. We need to make sure we carry through in the act of legislation, in the act of voting. We need to make sure that people are seeing beyond themselves so that we have equality, and that equality is sustainable. Because if we win tomorrow and lose the next day, we haven't achieved anything.
Well, thank you. You've made me hopeful. You've made me inspired. On behalf of the Sign Institute and AU Pride, thank you so much for, we know how busy you are, taking time and having this conversation with us. We will extend, when we can, be together again in person. You are welcome onto the university campus, and we'd like to have you come and spend some time with our students when you're able to. So thank you for sharing your personal story, the work of HRC. We will make sure here at the Sign Institute that we're sharing information about how you can either get involved or learn more. I know there's some great information on the website, and stay in touch. Thank you for spending time with us during Pride Month, and we really do look forward to getting you on campus again soon, Alphonso.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Amy.
Take care.